going on, y'all? Welcome to the fifth installment of What Do I Say When They Say. Today I want to focus on what we say when they say that Christianity is no different than mythology. Unfortunately, many people today are accusing Christianity of borrowing from ancient Near Eastern mythological stories. Christianity is viewed as having nothing to do with the real concrete world, and many of the narratives from Adam and Eve to the Tower of Babel, including the life of Christ, are seen as myth and legend. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what in fact do we say when they say that Christianity is no different than mythology? The first thing that we can say is that Christianity is investigatable. It is historically verifiable, which is not something that we can say about mythology. Jesus actually lived in a place where we can visit at a time in history that we can actually study, around people whose lives that we can actually research. If you open the Bible, you will find people like Herod of Judea. You will find people like Caesar of Augusta. These are real life people, real life places, real life events. Now, this is far different than mythology. Mythology has no real life geographical locations, no real life people, no real life places, no real life events. Therefore, it is not historically verifiable or investigatable, and Christianity is. The second thing that we can say is that many of the parallels that are drawn between Jesus and the mythological gods of legend are just simply not true. So there's some that will purport this idea that the virgin birth of Christ was copied from the virgin birth of, let's just say, Mithras or Adonis or even Horus. But we know that there's no historical basis for these ideas. As a matter of fact, we know that Horus was not born of a virgin, but instead was conceived by Osiris and Isis. And I don't know how familiar you are with the story, but it's kind of crazy where Seth cuts up Osiris and all of his members are scattered all over Egypt, and his private part goes down to the bottom of the ocean. And so Isis goes and retrieves his private part, and he and Isis have sex, and they give birth to Horus. The mythological story itself does not teach that Horus was born of a virgin, so Christianity did not copy from it. Or this notion that Jesus was born on December 25th, again, something else that Christians are accused of borrowing from some of the gods of legend. It's true, they were born on December 25th. However, the Bible does not teach us that Jesus was born on December 25th. So again, these are parallels that are unfounded and that there are no historical basis for, and I think this is an important argument against the idea that history and mythology are the same. So now here's the thing, many will still have a very legitimate question, a question I have even asked myself, and that is, why are the stories so similar? How is it that a story that predated the biblical historical account, let's just say the mythological story of Pandora's box, or let's just say the story of Noah's Ark, how is it so similar to the deluge stories or the creation story and the Enuma Elisha? If Christianity didn't copy, why are the stories so similar? There is a reasonable explanation for this. The time that these stories were circulating, there was not a lot of writing going on. Many of the narratives, let's just say the story of Adam and Eve or Noah's Ark or the Tower of Babel, the story of creation, many of those narratives were passed down orally. It was a culture of oral tradition. It was a culture of memorization. It wasn't an analytical culture like our culture. It was a culture of memorization. And obviously at that time, people retained a lot more. They used more of the capacity of their brain, kind of like when we used to be able to remember phone numbers. Well, back then, they were able to retain a lot more because that was the culture. I think a good example of this is in Jewish culture, where the Jewish children learned the first 5 books of the Old Testament by the age of 5, and the remaining books of the Old Testament by the age of 10. How in the world is that possible? Well, they retained information differently back then because the culture was different. The culture was a culture of oral transmission. So with that said, what would happen is each culture would get the story. So Babylonian culture would get the story of creation. Egyptian culture would get the story of creation. They will all hear these stories since they were circulating around the world. So each culture would get this story, and each culture would do what we do naturally, which is filter the story through their grid. In a polytheistic culture, if they heard the story of the Tower of Babel, it would not be one God, the story would consist of many gods because they're filtering it through their own experience, through their own understanding, through their own sociocultural and religious grid. Now, in this environment, it would make sense for there to be a gap between the time in which the story was told and the time in which the story was written. Again, in this environment, it would make sense for there to be a gap between the time in which the story was told and the time in which the story was written. So I think the biggest question we have to begin to ask ourselves is not who wrote it first, because that's what everybody's hung up on. Well, you know, the Egyptians wrote it first, or the Babylonians wrote it first, or these people wrote it first. I think the thing we need to be focusing on is not who wrote it first, but who got it right. So the three things that we can say when they say that Christianity is not any different than mythology is, number one, that Christianity is investigatable, that it is historically verifiable, and mythology is not. There are no real life people, places, and events in mythology, whereas in Christianity, there are real life people, places, and events. And if history is investigatable and Christianity is built upon the basis of historical evidence and claims, then Christianity then is objectively investigatable. The second thing we can say is that many of the parallels that are drawn are just unfounded and have no historical basis. And then the third thing that we can say when somebody just says, you know, okay, I get all of that, but you know, what about the fact that these stories are so similar? The question that I think we should build our research on is not who wrote it first, but who got it right. These are three things that we can say when they say that Christianity is no different than mythology.